sole for your feet. There's an argument based on the nature of the word Yahweh and Adonai and all that. Doesn't really matter. But Psalm 110, if you go down to verse 4, it says, Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Where have we heard that name before? Abraham. Abraham shows honor to Melchizedek. What do we know about Melchizedek from Genesis? He's a priest and king of Salem. Now the argument is no family, no lineage. Now who is he the priest of? Most High God, all right? So it's interesting. We don't know anything about him, but he's a priest of the Most High God, and he's king of Salem. Some will argue that this is actually the city of Jerusalem. Maybe. What's interesting is Salem has the same consonant block as the word shalom. What does shalom mean? Peace. King of peace. So it's interesting. He's a king of peace. He's a priest to the Most High God, and his name means king of righteousness, which is very interesting. Psalm 110, we see that his name is brought back into the picture. We don't really see it up to this point, right? It says, the Lord, or Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the Lord of Melchizedek. Where else have we seen Melchizedek? New Testament, Hebrews, right? And specifically dealing with the nature of Jesus, because should Jesus be a priest? He's not in the right family. What were the priestly family? Levi, right? Where was Jesus? Where is he from? He's from the tribe of Judah, the same tribe that David comes from. So when you're looking at by nature and what the Hebrew writer is going through there and saying, it says we have a new covenant, a New Testament that has brought and spoken of better than the Old Testament. For the blood of bulls and goats couldn't take away sin, but he is our propitiation. He is our sin offering. He's our atonement. And he goes through and he'll talk about the nature of who Jesus is. Jesus is the priest that offers the sacrifice. He's the sacrifice himself. His flesh is the veil of the temple. You know, so many different things that he's describing is the imagery of Jesus and what Jesus' purpose was for us to have salvation and redemption to God. So he brings in this nature of this priest after the order of Melchizedek. He has no lineage. What's interesting is if you're reading this and you're looking at it, it says, well, it was Christians that were misusing the text. Psalm 110 wasn't a messianic prophecy. It didn't really have anything to do with the promise of the coming Messiah or the lineage of David. It didn't really have any, it's a stretch, if you will. Well, in the 1940s, a young shepherd boy stumbled across some scrolls in these caves in the area of Qumran, which is right around the Dead Sea. It's what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's probably one of the most, if not the most greatest find of the 20th century as far as Old Testament studies. Now, how many New Testament texts did they find at Qumran? Zero. That's important. If you watch YouTube, people say, "Well, the New Testament was changed, and they found the scrolls at Qumran." No, it's all Old Testament. A good portion of it, though, is other texts, not necessarily Old Testament texts, but some texts that are just kind of fanciful in writing or historical fiction, if you will. Well, in Cave 11, they found something called the Heavenly Priest Melchizedek. And I'm going to read some of this to you because it's interesting. I want you to keep in mind that this is probably 100 to 200 years before the time of Jesus. So whenever you look at the New Testament that's written roughly 40s to 90s, depending on your dates, you'll have people say, well, they took Old Testament scriptures and they twisted them. Well, 100 years later, 200 years, or 100 years earlier, 200 years earlier, how were Jews in the first century around Palestine viewing some of these texts? So I'm going to read some of it. It says, and concerning that which he said, in this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property, from Leviticus chapter 25. And likewise, as this is the manner of release, every creditor shall release that which he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother. For God's release has been proclaimed, from Deuteronomy 15, and it will be proclaimed at the end of days concerning the captives, as he has said, to proclaim liberty to the captives, from Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1. Its interpretation is that he will assign them to the sons of heaven and to the inheritance of Melchizedek. For he will cast their lot amid the portions of Melchizedek, who will return them there and will proclaim to them liberty, forgiving them the wrongdoings of all their iniquities. And this thing will occur in the first week of the Jubilee that follows the 9 Jubilees. And the Day of Atonement is the end of the 10th Jubilee, when all the sons of light and the men of the lot of Melchizedek will be atoned for. And a statute concerns them to provide them with the rewards, for this is the moment of the year of grace for Melchizedek, and he will judge by his strength, judge the holy ones of God, executing judgment as it is written concerning him in the songs of David, who said, Elohim has taken his place in his divine counsel. In the midst of gods he holds judgment. This comes from Psalm 82. And it was concerning him that he said, let the assembly of the peoples return to the height above them. El, or God, will judge the peoples. Now it's interesting in this text, and I stopped it. I'm not going to read the entire thing to you. I wish I put it up here on the screen. But if I'd have read you the entire text, like kind of the theme with it, what did you notice about it? Who's going to judge the peoples? It says that El, God, is going to judge the peoples. Who else? It says Melchizedek, which is interesting. Now, I'm not saying that this is prophetic in nature. I'm not saying that this text was inspired by God. Not saying any of that. What I'm saying is, when you look at a text like this, 200 years before the time of Christ, they look at Psalm 110 in the order of Melchizedek. They look at nature of Isaiah 61. They tie those two texts together, looking at the coming Messiah. The Christians, before 1945 or the mid to late 40s, we didn't know any of this. And some people would say, well, the Christians just kind of took these Old Testament texts and made them what they wanted to make them. No, Jews, at least as far as we can tell, around the Qumran community, whether it's the community, whether it's the Essenes or a different group, whatever, they look at those texts as being tied together and being prophetic and talking about they're messianic in nature. So it's interesting that it talks about Melchizedek's going to judge, and they see him as a figure who's coming in at the end of days, the Day of Atonement or the Days of Atonement, as one who's going to judge the people as well as God himself judging the people. So it's just an interesting text that I think is kind of fun and something to keep in mind. So if somebody says, well, nobody really thought about that, well, they did. And we find more evidence of it. So Psalm 110, you look at it with the nature of the order of Melchizedek. Jews, 150, 200 years before the time of Jesus, tied this text in closely with our text this evening of Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61 is seated in several chapters that deal with God's redemptive power and what he's doing. It shows you exactly who the nation of Israel is and how faithless they are, shows you by the mercy and the grace and the faithfulness of God in these texts. So it's a very interesting text. It's what Jesus reads in in Luke chapter 4. It's by nature what he tells John's disciples when they are sent by John who's in prison. And the question is, are you the one, are you the Messiah, or should we look for another? And Jesus says back to them this text, and talking about the restoration of the sight of the blind and so on and so forth. So that's the importance of Isaiah chapter 61 when it comes to Messianic prophecy and the nature of God's redemption at the end of this book. So we'll pick up there. We read through some of it last week. We'll go through it a little bit more detail. Okay, the Spirit of Yahweh, the Lord God, is upon me because Yahweh has anointed me. Again, that word anointed is where it's the verb for where we get the word Messiah. To bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. That word good news there in the Greek Septuagint Do you know what word that is? It's gospel. So whenever you hear the idea of the good news, a lot of times your translation may have that as opposed to the gospel. It's a better translation. That word didn't just come out of anywhere, just a poof. They didn't put it there on the pages like, oh, we'll call this the gospel. No, it comes from this text. The good news being preached to the poor, this is the gospel. Very much tied into the messianic purpose and prophecy concerning Jesus. To bring good news to the poor, he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. You have that tied together, the day of vengeance with comfort to those who mourn. It's interesting in this text when he talks about opening the prison up of those who are bound. What's he talking about? What kind of prison? Paul spent a lot of time in prison. Peter spent a lot of time in prison. It's prisoners of sin. By nature, that's what he's talking about. By prisoners, we're held captive. It's Paul's point in Romans chapter 6. You are a slave to the one you serve, either sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness. Romans chapter 6 into chapter 7 there, Paul is making the point very plain. You can't serve two masters. One has a very, very clear end. The other one has the positive end, right? So same thing here. The idea is he's opening the prisons to those who are bound, those who are captive. And nothing holds men more captive than sin, which leads to death. All right, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of Yahweh, that he may be glorified. In other words, Jesus didn't just invent this idea of a plant or talk about agriculture when he's talking about the gospel. This is a tree that God's going to plant. It's what he does with his people. It's what he does for the world. It is his people so that he can be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. We're going to see this throughout the end of the book of Isaiah, this restoration, these new things that are coming about. It's not like the world that we've known before. It's something greater that's coming. Strangers shall stand and tend your flocks. Foreigners shall be your plowmen and your vine dressers. But you shall be called the priests of Yahweh. They shall speak of you as the ministers of our God. You shall eat the wealth of the nations, and in their glory you shall boast. Instead of your shame there shall be a double portion. Instead of dishonor they shall rejoice in their lot. Therefore in their land they shall possess a double portion. They shall have everlasting joy. Now, some of this has to do with the nation of Israel coming back into Zion, into Jerusalem, restoration of the temple after it is destroyed by the Babylonians. That's part of it. But there's always this overarching theme of something even greater. Verse 8, for I, Yahweh, love justice. I hate robbery and wrong. I will faithfully give them the recompense. I will make an everlasting covenant with them. Same thing that's kind of spoken of Jeremiah in chapter 31. Their offspring shall be known among the nations, and their descendants in the midst of the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge them, that they are an offspring. Yahweh has blessed. I will greatly rejoice in Yahweh. My soul shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself like a priest with a beautiful headdress, and as the bride adorns herself with her jewels, for as the earth brings forth its sprouts, and as the garden causes what is sown to be sprouted up, so Yahweh, the Lord God, will cause righteousness and praise to sprout up before all the nations. Okay, so this is a transition. You see it in chapter 60. You see the nature of it in chapter 61, where God is going to restore those things that have been torn down. He's going to bring glory back to his people. And this is kind of the transition into what he talks about. Chapter 62, he carries on this idea. Now you've got to keep in mind, he's talking about Zion. What's Zion? Or Mount Zion, where is that? It's in Jerusalem. It's in Jerusalem. And God is going to restore Jerusalem back to its former glory. But does it ever reach its former glory? Really? Not much. Not much. And we talked about it last week. There are arguments that we found among the Essenes as well as some other groups where there were arguments against the temple that Herod built. There's not the Ark of the Covenant. There's not the Shekinah, the glory of God doesn't come in. The Urim and Thummim, Paul reminded me of what the priests would wear to decide certain things. So there are several things that were not in the second temple that were in the first temple. But whenever you hear the prophets talking about the second temple having more glory given to it, there's something greater coming. It's the nature of who Jesus is and the fact that Jesus comes. And whenever Jesus cleanses the temple, that's kind of by nature what he's doing. So, and it's interesting whenever Jesus refers to his body, what does he call it? He says, destroy this temple. Read about it in John. Destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up again. What does John say he's talking about his temple being? Talking about his body. Why is Jesus' body the temple? Because God chose to dwell, right? God chose to dwell there. You go back to John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He pitched his tent among us. He set up his tabernacle among us in the bodily form of Christ. So that's by nature of where we're getting. Chapter 62, you're dealing with that nature. We'll kind of read through some of this. Verse 1, for Zion's sake I will keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not be quiet until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a burning torch. The nations shall see your righteousness, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of Yahweh will give. And you shall be a crown of beauty in the land, or in the hand of Yahweh, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, for your land shall no more be termed desolate. But you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your hand, or in your land married. For Yahweh delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. On your walls, O Jerusalem, I have set watchmen all the day and all the night, that they shall never be silent. You who put Yahweh in remembrance, take no rest and give him no rest until he establishes Jerusalem and makes it a praise in the earth. Again, talking about Jerusalem and the nature of what it was to become. Where have we seen watchmen before? What's a famous passage about watchmen?
They're responsible for warning, and if they don't, they're responsible for the souls of the lost.
Yeah, it's a common theme among the prophets. Ezekiel talks about the watchman. That's the idea. It's like if the watchman sees terror coming upon the city and doesn't warn, who's responsible? The watchman. If they warn and nobody listens, it's their problem. Which is, in Ezekiel's case, it was their problem because they didn't listen to Ezekiel. To be fair, he did weird things, but they didn't listen to the prophets. It's like, oh, I'd love to be a prophet of God. Go read the prophets. It's not always hunky-dory for them. It's not always great. Nobody really wants to listen to him. So that's kind of nature what he's talking about. Let's go. Read verse 11. Behold, Yahweh has proclaimed to the end of the earth. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your salvation comes. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. And they shall be called the holy people, the redeemed of Yahweh. And you shall be called sought out, a city not forsaken. Again, you have within this these passages in chapter 61, this idea of salvation and glory being brought back to the people of God. In this case, the immediate context is the nation of Israel with Jerusalem, that after it's destroyed, it'll be restored. In the distant context, you have people of God, those who are faithful to Him. Chapter 63.
Wayne,
Yes.
they're talking about the spiritual Jerusalem versus that which is a church.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all that, when you say it wasn't as glorious, that...
In John chapter 6, the disciples they go away. It's within that understanding, when he's standing before Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world. The question is, was the kingdom in the world? Is the kingdom in the world today? Yes, it is. There's two notions of kingdom, and even in the language that the